The world ended faster than anyone expected. At first, the news talked about a strange infection spreading through several cities. People getting sick, aggressive, violent. Within days, hospitals were overwhelmed. Within weeks, entire cities collapsed. Then the dead started walking. By the time people realized it wasn't just a disease, it was already too late. Governments fell. Communications stopped. Roads filled with abandoned cars. Fires burned across entire districts. And the dead, they were everywhere. I had been working at a construction site outside the city when everything happened. The project had been paused after the outbreak started, but I stayed behind to gather tools and supplies before heading home. That decision saved my life. When the panic began, thousands of people flooded the roads trying to escape. Many never made it. I watched the chaos from the top of the construction crane. The crane towered nearly 60 meters above the ground. From the small operator's cabin at the top, I could see the entire city skyline, and the endless waves of infected moving through the streets. At first, I thought I would only stay there for a few hours. Maybe a day. But that night, I saw something that changed everything. A group of survivors tried to run through the construction yard below. Maybe 6 or 7 people. They looked exhausted, terrified. Behind them came dozens of the infected. The survivors never stood a chance. The screams echoed across the empty construction site. I watched from the crane cabin, powerless. That was the moment I realized the truth. There was no rescue coming. The city was gone. And the crane might be the safest place left. The infected couldn't climb the vertical ladder easily, and the narrow access made it possible to defend if they tried. The cabin itself was small, barely enough room for a chair, the control panel, and a narrow bench, but it was shelter. And most importantly, it was high above the dead. The next morning I began preparing for something I never imagined. Survival. I climbed down carefully, scanning every corner of the construction yard. The site was mostly empty, but the workers had left behind tools, ropes, tarps, and crates of equipment. Perfect. Over the next 2 days I carried everything up the crane ladder piece by piece. Water bottles, canned food, a toolbox, flashlights, batteries, a portable radio, even a small camping stove. By the end of the second day, the crane cabin had turned into a tiny survival shelter in the sky. From up there, I could see everything. The silent streets, burning buildings in the distance, and the endless movement of the infected wandering through the ruins. That night, I sat inside the cabin as the wind rocked the crane slightly back and forth. Below me, the zombies wandered through the construction yard. Slow, relentless, waiting, and I realized something terrifying. If I wanted to survive, I might be stuck in this crane cabin for a very long time. The first week inside the crane cabin was the hardest. The silence of the ruined city was worse than the noise had ever been. From 60 meters above the ground, the world looked almost peaceful. The streets were empty. The buildings stood still against the gray sky. But the movement below told the real story. Zombies wandered everywhere, sometimes just 1 or 2. Sometimes dozens drifting through the streets like a slow river of death. From the cabin, I could watch them for hours. It became my way of learning how this new world worked. They weren't fast. That was the first thing I noticed. But they were persistent. And there were a lot of them. The construction yard below had become their wandering ground. At least 20 of them moved between the unfinished buildings and stacks of concrete blocks. If they ever managed to climb the crane ladder, I would have nowhere to go. So the first thing I did was make the ladder harder to reach. About 10 meters above the ground, I removed one of the ladder sections. It wasn't easy, but with a wrench and some time I managed to loosen the bolts and drop the metal section to the ground. Now there was a gap. Even if a zombie tried to climb, it would get stuck there. That made me feel a little safer. But safety didn't solve the real problem. Food. The supplies I carried up during the first 2 days were enough for maybe a week, if I was careful. That meant I had to do something I really didn't want to do. Go down. I waited until night. During the day the zombies wandered more, but at night they seemed slower. Some just stood still in dark corners like statues. The moon was thin, barely lighting the construction yard. Perfect. I tied a rope to the crane ladder and slowly climbed down the first part. When I reached the missing ladder section, I used the rope to lower myself to the ground. For the first time in days, my boots touched the earth again. It felt strange being down there. Too exposed. Too close to the dead. I moved quietly toward the site office building. The workers used to store tools and snacks there. If I was lucky, maybe something useful was left behind. Every step felt loud. Every shadow looked like it might move. Then I heard it, a low growl behind me. I turned slowly. A zombie stood only 15 meters away. Its head tilted slightly as it stared in my direction. Then it started walking, slow, but straight toward me. My heart started pounding. If it made noise, more would come. I grabbed a metal pipe lying near a stack of bricks. The zombie kept coming. 10 meters, 8 meters, 6. When it got close enough, I swung the pipe as hard as I could. The sound echoed across the yard. The zombie dropped instantly, but the noise had done exactly what I feared. In the darkness, shapes began moving. More zombies. I didn't wait to count them. I ran inside the office building, slammed the door shut, and started searching. Canned food, bottled water, energy bars, a backpack. Jackpot. I stuffed everything inside as fast as possible. Outside, the scratching had already started. The zombies had found the door. There was no time left. I grabbed the backpack and sprinted back toward the crane. The yard was no longer empty. At least a dozen zombies were moving toward me. My lungs burned as I reached the rope and began climbing. Hands grabbed at the air below me as the dead gathered at the base of the crane. I climbed faster than I ever had in my life. When I finally pulled myself back into the cabin, I collapsed on the floor. Breathing hard, alive. Below me, the zombies wandered in circles around the crane, waiting. But I had food now. Enough for a few more weeks. And that meant one thing. This wasn't just hiding anymore. This was survival. By the second week, the crane cabin had become my entire world. It was small, barely big enough to stretch my legs, but I started organizing everything carefully. Food in one corner, tools in another, water bottles stacked under the control panel. The backpack from the office raid had helped a lot. Canned beans, crackers, a few chocolate bars, even some instant coffee packets. Luxury, in a dead world. From the cabin windows, I could see almost everything around the construction site. The view stretched across the broken city skyline, abandoned buildings, empty highways, smoke rising from somewhere far away. Sometimes fires still burned, sometimes explosions echoed in the distance. But no helicopters, no military, no rescue, just the wind, and the dead. The zombies still wandered through the construction yard below, though their numbers changed every day. Some drifted away into the streets. Others arrived from somewhere beyond the nearby blocks. They moved slowly, endlessly. Like the world itself had turned into a graveyard that refused to stay quiet. But the real danger came from something else. The weather. On the 12th night, dark clouds rolled in from the west. At first it was just wind. Strong gusts shaking the crane slightly. I didn't think much of it. Until the storm hit. Rain slammed against the cabin windows like bullets. The wind howled around the steel tower, making the entire crane sway back and forth. Not a lot, but enough to make my stomach drop. 60 meters above the ground suddenly felt a lot higher. The metal structure groaned under the pressure of the storm. Every bolt and beam vibrated as the wind pushed against the long crane arm. I held onto the control panel, staring out into the darkness. Lightning flashed across the sky. For a split second, the entire construction yard lit up, and I saw them. Dozens of zombies. More than I had ever seen before. The storm must have drawn them from all directions. They stumbled through the rain, gathering around the crane base like insects around a tower of light. The thunder made them restless. Some of them started pushing against the crane's ladder. One even tried to climb. It reached the missing ladder section, and fell. But it didn't stop them from trying. Lightning flashed again. More zombies. The yard was filling up. And the storm kept getting worse. The crane began swaying harder now, the long arm creaking like a giant metal skeleton in the wind. For the first time since I climbed into the cabin, fear hit me hard. What if the crane couldn't handle the storm? What if the wind snapped something? What if the entire structure collapsed? I looked down. At least 30 zombies now circled the base. Waiting. The rain poured harder. The crane swayed again. I sat in the dark cabin, gripping the metal frame, listening to the storm rage around me. Below me, the dead gathered in silence. And all I could think was one terrifying thought. If this crane falls, I won't survive the night. The storm lasted all night. Wind screamed across the skyline like the world itself was tearing apart. The crane groaned with every gust, the long metal arm swaying above the ruined construction site. I barely slept. Most of the night I sat on the cabin floor, gripping the metal frame while rain hammered the windows. Every loud creak made my heart jump. But somehow, the crane held. When the sun finally began rising over the city, the storm slowly faded away. The wind died first, then the rain stopped. A quiet, gray morning replaced the chaos of the night before. I carefully stood and looked out through the wet cabin window. The construction yard looked different now. Flooded puddles filled the dirt ground. Debris had been scattered everywhere. One of the temporary fences had collapsed during the storm. But what caught my attention most were the zombies. There were so many. At least 40 of them wandered around the crane base. Some stood still in the mud. Others drifted slowly between stacks of concrete pipes and steel beams. The storm had drawn them in from everywhere. And now they were staying. That meant going down for supplies had just become much harder. I checked my food. Still enough for maybe 2 weeks if I rationed carefully. Water was fine too. The rainstorm had filled several containers I left outside the cabin window. That gave me time. But eventually, I would have to go back down again. I leaned against the window and scanned the distant streets through a pair of binoculars I found earlier. The view from 60 meters up was incredible. The city stretched endlessly in every direction. Burned buildings, crashed cars, empty highways, and sometimes, movement. Zombies wandered through intersections like lost travelers with no destination. But then I noticed something strange. Far away, maybe 2 kilometers from the construction site, a thin column of smoke rose into the sky. Not black smoke like a fire. Gray smoke. Controlled. Like a campfire. My heart started beating faster. Smoke meant one thing. Survivors. Someone out there was still alive. For the first time since the outbreak, I wasn't completely alone. But reaching them wouldn't be easy. Between me and that distant smoke stood an entire city full of the dead. And right now, dozens of them were already waiting below my crane. Still, the thought stayed in my mind the entire day. Somewhere out there, people were surviving too, and maybe one day, if I could find the right moment to leave this steel tower, I might reach them. But that decision could wait. Because that afternoon something happened that made my blood run cold. One of the zombies below had found something interesting. The ladder. And it wasn't alone anymore. The zombie stood at the base of the crane ladder, staring upward. At first it just wandered around like the others, bumping into the metal supports and dragging its feet through the mud left by the storm. But then something changed. It grabbed the ladder. Slowly, clumsily, it began to climb. I leaned closer to the window, watching carefully. The creature moved awkwardly, its arms stiff and jerky. But it was climbing. My stomach tightened. It reached the missing ladder section, the gap I had created days ago. For a moment it hung there, fingers scraping against the metal above it. Then it slipped. The zombie fell backwards and slammed into the ground. It didn't get up again. For a few seconds I felt relief. But that feeling didn't last long. Because the noise had attracted attention. Another zombie walked toward the ladder. Then another. Soon 4 of them stood at the crane base, bumping into each other, reaching for the metal rungs. They began trying to climb. One after another they pulled themselves up a few meters, then fell. Their bodies piled up beneath the ladder like broken mannequins. But something about it bothered me. They weren't just wandering anymore. They were learning, or at least reacting to something. And if enough of them gathered, the pile of bodies might eventually reach the missing ladder section. That thought made my chest tighten. 60 meters above the ground suddenly didn't feel as safe. I grabbed my binoculars again and scanned the yard. More zombies were drifting in from the streets. The storm had changed their movement patterns. What used to be a quiet construction site was slowly turning into a gathering point. And if their numbers kept growing, I might end up trapped in this cabin. Forever. That night I sat quietly in the dark, listening to the sounds below. The occasional groan, feet dragging through the mud. The slow, endless movement of the dead. The backpack of food beside me suddenly felt much smaller. If the zombies surrounded the crane completely, going down for supplies would be impossible. And starvation would eventually finish what the apocalypse started. But while staring out into the darkness, another idea slowly formed in my mind. The crane, not just the tower, the arm. The long steel boom stretched almost 30 meters across the construction site. And at the far end of it hung the heavy lifting hook used to move steel beams and concrete blocks. A rope system connected it directly to the cabin controls. If the crane still worked, I might have a way to move supplies. Without climbing down, I looked at the dusty control panel beside the operator's chair. The power indicator lights were dark. But the construction site had once run on generators. And generators meant fuel. Somewhere down there, there might still be power. And if I could bring the crane back to life, This steel tower wouldn't just be my shelter anymore. It would become my weapon against the dead. The idea kept me awake most of the night. If the crane still worked, everything could change. Instead of risking my life every time I needed supplies, I could use the crane arm to lift things from the ground. I could move crates, bags, even barrels up to the cabin. But first, the crane needed power, and that meant going back down. I waited until early morning. The zombies were still wandering around the crane base, but their numbers had dropped during the night. Many had drifted back toward the nearby streets. Still too many for comfort, but manageable. I packed light this time. Just a knife, the metal pipe from before, and the empty backpack. Slowly, I climbed down the ladder until I reached the missing section. Then I lowered myself using the rope. When my boots touched the muddy ground, my heart began pounding again. Every time I was down there, the world felt louder, more dangerous. The dead could appear from anywhere. I moved quickly toward the main construction building. If there was a generator, that's where it would be. The door was still damaged from my last supply run. I slipped inside and closed it behind me as quietly as possible. The building smelled like oil and dust. Tools were scattered across the floor. And in the far corner, I saw it, a large yellow generator. My heart jumped. I walked over and checked the fuel gauge. Half full. Even better. The power cable ran along the floor and disappeared through a hole in the wall toward the crane base outside. This was perfect. I grabbed the starter cord and pulled. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. For a moment I thought the generator was dead too. Then I noticed the small switch on the side. I flipped it, pulled the cord again. The machine coughed once. Pulled again. The generator suddenly roared to life. The loud engine noise filled the building instantly. And that's when I realized my mistake. Outside, the zombies heard it. Groans echoed through the construction yard. Feet dragging. Bodies moving. The sound was like a dinner bell for the dead. I grabbed the backpack and ran outside. 3 zombies were already turning toward the generator building. More shapes moved between the unfinished structures. No time. I sprinted back toward the crane ladder and grabbed the rope. Behind me, the first zombie stumbled closer. Then another. I climbed fast, pulling myself up the rope as quickly as my arms allowed. Hands reached upward from below, rotting fingers scraping the metal tower. But they were still too far away. When I finally climbed back into the crane cabin, I slammed the door shut and collapsed against the wall. Below me, at least 15 zombies had gathered around the generator building. The engine noise kept roaring. But something else happened too. The control panel in the crane cabin flickered. One small green light turned on. Power. My hand slowly moved to the crane controls. I grabbed the main lever and pushed it forward. At first, nothing happened. Then the entire crane arm began moving. The giant steel boom slowly rotated above the construction yard. The heavy hook hanging from the cables swayed through the air. I stared out the window in disbelief. The crane was alive again. And now, the dead below weren't just surrounding my shelter. They were standing under a machine that could crush them. Building construction man zombie. For the first time since the apocalypse started, I finally had the high ground. The crane controls felt strange in my hands. Before the outbreak, I had only used the crane a few times while helping the operators move steel beams across the construction site. Now it was the most powerful tool I had left in the world. Below me, the zombies wandered around the generator building, drawn by the loud engine. They had no idea what was about to happen. I slowly pulled one of the levers. The crane arm rotated smoothly above the yard. The heavy steel hook hanging from the cables swayed like a giant pendulum in the air. I positioned it directly above the group of zombies. My heart pounded. Then I pressed the lower control. The cable began unwinding. The hook dropped. Faster, faster, until, crash, the heavy steel block at the end of the hook smashed directly into the ground. 3 zombies disappeared beneath the impact. The others staggered away, confused by the sudden destruction. A grin spread across my face. For the first time in weeks, I had control. I raised the hook again and swung the crane arm sideways. The massive weight cut through another group of zombies like a wrecking ball. Bones snapped. Bodies collapsed. Within minutes, the entire construction yard was scattered with broken corpses. The remaining zombies slowly wandered away, leaving the crane base almost empty again. I leaned back in the chair, breathing heavily. The crane wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon, and maybe even more important, it could help me survive. That afternoon I started experimenting. Using the crane hook, I managed to grab a plastic crate from the ground and lift it carefully toward the cabin. It took several tries to guide it close enough to reach with a rope, but eventually I pulled it inside. Inside the crate were construction supplies, gloves, rope, duct tape, and a small toolbox. Not food, but still useful. If I kept doing this, I could search the entire construction site without leaving the crane. Safer, smarter, but while I worked, something else caught my attention. Movement in the distance. Through the binoculars I saw several figures walking along the road near the construction site. Not zombies. People. 3 survivors. They moved cautiously between abandoned cars, carrying backpacks and weapons. For a moment I thought about calling out to them. But then something else appeared behind them. A massive horde. Hundreds of zombies flooding through the street like a dark river. The survivors hadn't noticed yet. And they were walking straight toward the construction yard. Toward my crane. Toward safety. But if the horde followed them here, my safe tower could turn into the worst trap imaginable. And I had only minutes to decide. Help them, or stay hidden and survive alone. Through the binoculars, I watched the 3 survivors moving slowly along the cracked road. 2 men and a woman. They looked exhausted, their clothes torn and dirty, backpacks hanging heavily from their shoulders. One of the men carried what looked like a rifle. The other held a crowbar. They were survivors. Real people. Alive. For a moment I just stood there, frozen. After weeks alone in the crane cabin, seeing other humans felt almost unreal. But then I looked past them again. The horde. It was enormous. Hundreds of zombies pouring through the street behind them like a slow-moving wave of death. The survivors hadn't seen them yet. They were too focused on the ground in front of them, carefully stepping around abandoned cars and broken glass. If they kept walking like that, the horde would reach them within minutes. I had to make a decision. Fast. If they ran toward the crane, they might survive. But if the horde followed them into the construction yard, the crane could become surrounded by hundreds of the dead. I might never escape again. I looked at the crane controls. Then back at the survivors. I sighed. Damn it, I muttered to myself. I grabbed a metal wrench from the toolbox and stepped outside the cabin onto the small platform. The wind was stronger up there. 60 meters above the ground. I raised the wrench and started smashing it against the steel railing. Clang, clang, clang. The sound echoed across the construction yard like a giant alarm bell. The survivors froze instantly. They looked around in confusion. Then one of them spotted the crane. Spotted me. I waved my arms and pointed toward the construction yard. Up here, I shouted, though I knew they probably couldn't hear me clearly. But they understood. Their faces lit up with sudden hope. They began running. Behind them, the horde reacted to the noise. Hundreds of zombies turned in the same direction. Toward the crane. Toward the sound. The survivors sprinted through the construction gate just as the first wave of zombies spilled into the street behind them. My heart raced. Move, 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 I whispered. They reached the base of the crane tower and immediately began climbing the ladder. The woman first, then the man with the crowbar. The man with the rifle stayed on the ground for a moment, covering the others as the first zombies reached the construction yard. Then he grabbed the ladder and started climbing too. Below them, the horde poured through the gate. Dozens, then hundreds. The construction yard filled with the dead faster than I had ever seen before. I rushed back inside the cabin and grabbed the crane controls. If they fell, I might be able to clear the zombies beneath them. But the survivors climbed fast. They reached the missing ladder section. The rope. One by one they used it to pull themselves higher. My heart pounded as they climbed closer and closer to the cabin. Below them, the horde gathered at the crane base. Hundreds of dead bodies pressing against the steel tower. Reaching upward. Waiting. Finally, the first survivor pulled herself onto the platform beside the cabin. She collapsed onto the floor, breathing hard. The other two followed seconds later. For the first time since the apocalypse began, I wasn't alone in the crane anymore. But looking down at the massive horde surrounding the tower, I realized something terrifying. Saving them might have just trapped all of us. For a moment, none of us spoke. The three survivors lay on the metal platform outside the crane cabin, gasping for air after the brutal climb. Their hands were shaking, their clothes soaked with sweat and dirt. I opened the cabin door slowly. "Get inside," I said. Quick. One by one they crawled into the tiny cabin. Suddenly the space that once felt small now felt impossibly crowded. The woman leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. She looked to be in her late 20s, with short dark hair and a cut across her forehead. The man with the crowbar was older, maybe 40, with a thick beard and tired eyes. The third man, the one carrying the rifle, looked at me carefully before speaking. "You saved us," he said. I shrugged slightly. Let's just say, I didn't want to watch another group die. Below us, the horde groaned and shuffled around the crane base. Hundreds of zombies pressed against the steel structure, reaching upward like a sea of rotting hands. The survivors slowly noticed the view. The woman crawled toward the window and looked down. Her eyes widened instantly. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Yeah," I replied quietly. "Welcome to my problem." The man with the rifle introduced himself first. "My name's Alex." He pointed toward the others. "This is Marta, and Daniel." I nodded. "Good to meet you. Well, just call me the crane guy." Daniel chuckled weakly. "Best nickname I've heard all year." Marta leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. "We thought we were dead," she said quietly. "That horde came out of nowhere." Alex looked around the cabin carefully. Food supplies, tools, water bottles, rope. "You've been here a while," he said. 3 weeks, I answered. Daniel looked out the window again. "And those things have been down there the whole time." "Not that many," I said. "The storm brought more." And your little parade added a few hundred. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Great. For a few minutes the cabin stayed quiet while everyone caught their breath. Then Alex noticed the crane controls. His eyebrows lifted. Wait, does this thing still work? I smiled slightly. Watch this. I grabbed the control lever and rotated the crane arm. The massive boom slowly moved across the construction yard. Alex stepped closer to the window. No way. I lowered the heavy hook into the crowd of zombies below. Then I swung it sideways. Crunch. Several zombies were smashed instantly. Daniel burst out laughing. That's incredible. Marta stared down at the destruction. So, we're living in a zombie blender now. Something like that, I said. Alex looked back at me, suddenly serious again. This could actually work. What do you mean? If we control the crane, we can keep the zombies away from the base. He pointed toward the city. And eventually, we might even clear a path out of here. The idea hung in the air. Escape. For weeks I had believed the crane would be my prison forever. But now there were 4 of us. 4 survivors. 4 minds. Maybe, just maybe, this tower wasn't the end of the road. Maybe it was the beginning of a plan. Living alone in the crane cabin had been difficult. Living with 3 other people was something else entirely. The cabin was never meant for more than 1 operator. Now 4 adults were crammed into the small metal box 60 meters above a construction yard full of zombies. But none of us complained. Down below was death. Up here, at least we had a chance. We spent the first day reorganizing everything. Food supplies were counted. Water bottles were divided carefully. Marta used the duct tape and spare cloth to clean and bandage the cut on her forehead. Daniel inspected the crane controls with curiosity. You actually figured out how to run this thing? He asked. Trial and error, I said. He nodded. Good enough for the apocalypse. Alex, the one with the rifle, took the role of lookout. From the cabin windows he constantly scanned the city with my binoculars, watching the movement of the dead. The horde below us was still massive. Hundreds of zombies filled the construction yard and the nearby street. They wandered in circles around the crane base, occasionally bumping into each other or the steel tower. But they couldn't climb, and whenever too many gathered in one spot, I used the crane. Crash. The heavy hook smashed into the crowd again and again, breaking bones and scattering bodies. Every time it swung through the horde, the zombies thinned a little more. It was slow work, but it worked. That evening we sat together in the cabin while the sun sank behind the ruined city. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel so lonely. Daniel opened one of the cans of beans and passed it around. 5-star dinner, he joked. Marta smiled faintly. Better than starving. Alex kept looking through the binoculars. What do you see? I asked. Movement in the city, he said. Small groups of zombies mostly. Nothing like the horde down there. He lowered the binoculars. Whatever happened here, it must have pulled them all toward this area. Daniel looked down through the window again. Which means if we ever leave this crane, we'll be walking into the biggest zombie traffic jam in the world. Marta crossed her arms. So maybe we don't leave. The cabin went quiet. Stay here forever. It sounded crazy. But right now, the crane was the safest place any of us had seen since the apocalypse started. Alex finally spoke. We can't stay forever. Food will run out eventually. He looked at me. You said the crane can lift crates, right? Yeah. Daniel's eyes lit up. Then we use it. Use it how? Marta asked. Daniel pointed toward the construction yard. We start collecting supplies. Everything we can find down there. He pointed toward the city beyond. And eventually, we reach further. I frowned slightly. Further how? Daniel smiled. We build something. What kind of something? He looked at the crane arm stretching across the construction site. A bridge. The idea sounded insane, but also possible. If the crane could move steel beams. If we could connect nearby rooftops. If we could avoid the streets completely. We might actually travel through the city. Above the zombies. For the first time since they arrived, all four of us stared out at the ruined world with the same thought. Maybe survival wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it was time to start rebuilding a way forward. The next morning, Daniel was already studying the construction yard through the cabin window. "Look there," he said, pointing toward a stack of long steel beams lying near one of the unfinished buildings. They used those for the upper floors. I followed his finger with the binoculars. Heavy I-beams, about 6 meters long, strong enough to support serious weight. Daniel grinned. "That's our bridge." Marta looked skeptical. "You want to build a bridge? From a crane? 60 meters in the air?" Daniel shrugged. "It's better than walking through the zombie highway down there." Alex folded his arms. He's not wrong. The plan was risky, but we didn't have many options. If we could reach nearby rooftops using steel beams, we might move across the city without touching the ground. And if that worked, the city would open up to us again. Food, supplies, maybe even other survivors. So we started. I took my seat at the crane controls while the others watched carefully. The crane arm slowly rotated toward the stack of steel beams below. The hook descended through the air until it hovered just above them. "Little left," Daniel said, guiding me. I adjusted the controls. "Lower it." The hook dropped onto the first beam with a loud clang. Alex leaned out slightly from the window and used a rope with a metal loop to help secure the beam to the hook. "Got it," he shouted. "All right," I said. I pulled the lever slowly. The crane cable tightened. The massive steel beam lifted off the ground. For a moment, all four of us just stared. "It worked." Daniel laughed. "We're actually doing this." I carefully rotated the crane arm toward the nearest building beside the construction site. It was an unfinished apartment block, maybe 15 meters away from the crane tower. Its rooftop looked empty. "Perfect. Easy, easy," Daniel said. I lowered the beam slowly until one end rested against the edge of the rooftop. Alex used another rope to pull the other end closer to the crane tower. The beam now formed a narrow metal bridge between the crane structure and the building. No wider than a foot, but strong. Marta stared at it nervously. "You expect us to walk across that?" Daniel shrugged. "Unless you want to climb down and fight a few hundred zombies." She sighed. "Fair point." Alex grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the narrow beam carefully. The wind blew across the open space between the crane and the rooftop. 60 meters below, zombies still wandered around the construction yard. One wrong step, and the fall would kill him before the dead even reached him. He moved slowly. One step, then another. The beam creaked slightly but held firm. My hands tightened around the crane controls as I watched. 10 steps. 15. Finally, Alex jumped onto the rooftop. He turned back toward us and raised his thumb. "It's solid." Daniel pumped his fist in the air. Marta shook her head in disbelief. "We're insane." But she stepped onto the beam next. One by one, we crossed from the crane cabin to the rooftop. When my feet finally touched the concrete roof beside the others, I turned back and looked at the crane towering behind us. For weeks it had been my entire world. My shelter. My prison. Now it was something else. A launch point. From the rooftop, the ruined city stretched endlessly before us. Empty streets. Collapsed buildings. Smoke drifting across the skyline. And somewhere out there, more survivors. Alex adjusted his rifle strap. "Well," he said, "welcome back to the world." And for the first time since the apocalypse began, we were walking in it again. Standing on the rooftop felt strange. For weeks the crane cabin had been my entire world. Now the open sky stretched above us and the ruined city spread out in every direction. Freedom, but also danger. From the rooftop edge we could see the streets below. Cars were scattered everywhere, many burned or crashed into buildings. The sidewalks were filled with the slow movement of zombies wandering aimlessly through the ruins. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands across the city. Alex kept his rifle ready while he scanned the nearby rooftops. "Good news," he said after a moment. "What?" Marta asked. "Most of the zombies are down on the streets. Very few up here." Daniel nodded. "That's why the bridge idea works." He pointed toward another building across the street. About 10 meters away stood a taller office building. Its rooftop had air conditioning units and metal vents scattered across the surface. "If we reach that building," Daniel said, "we can go further into the city." I looked back toward the crane. The steel beam we used as a bridge still rested between the tower and the rooftop. "Our supply line," I said. Marta smiled slightly. "Our sky highway. But we still needed to cross to the next building. Luckily, the crane arm could reach that far." We walked carefully back to the crane bridge and crossed one by one again. Once inside the cabin, I started the crane controls. The giant boom rotated slowly above the street between the buildings. Below us, dozens of zombies wandered between abandoned cars. None of them noticed the massive steel beam being lowered above their heads. Daniel secured another beam to the hook. "All right," he said. "Let's try this again." The crane lifted the beam high into the air and slowly carried it toward the next building. This one was trickier. There was a wider gap between rooftops. Wind pushed against the beam as it hung from the cable. "Careful, careful," Marta whispered. Finally the far end touched the rooftop of the office building. Alex used a rope to guide the other end into position. Clang! The beam settled across the gap. "Another bridge." Daniel laughed again. "Look at that." Alex tested it first, stepping onto the narrow steel beam. The drop below was terrifying. At least 50 meters straight down to the street full of zombies. He moved slowly but confidently. Halfway across, a strong gust of wind shook the beam slightly. My heart skipped a beat. But Alex kept moving. Finally he reached the other rooftop and climbed onto the concrete surface. "Clear," he shouted. Marta went next. Then Daniel. I crossed last. When all four of us stood on the new rooftop, we looked around carefully. This building was different. Near the center of the roof was a small access door leading down into the structure. Daniel noticed it first. He pointed toward the door. "Well," Alex raised his rifle. "Looks like it's time to see what's inside." The rooftop path had worked. We had escaped the crane. But now we faced something even more unpredictable. The inside of the dead city. The rooftop door looked untouched. Dust covered the metal handle, and the small window in the center was cracked but still intact. No signs of forced entry. No blood. That was a good sign. But in this world, Good signs could still hide bad surprises. Alex moved first. He raised his rifle and slowly pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly in the quiet morning air. We all froze. For a moment we listened. Nothing. No groans. No movement. Just silence. Alex stepped inside carefully, his rifle aimed into the dark stairwell beyond the door. "Clear," he whispered. We followed him inside. The air inside the building smelled stale, like dust and old paper. Emergency lights along the stairwell walls were dead, leaving the inside dim and shadowy. The stairwell spiraled downward through the building. Daniel closed the rooftop door behind us. "Well," he said quietly, "first time indoors in a while." Marta ran a hand along the wall. "This must have been an office building." Alex nodded. "Which means there might be food, water, maybe even supplies." We moved down one flight of stairs. Alex stayed in front. I followed behind him. Marta and Daniel brought up the rear. Every step echoed through the empty stairwell. Halfway down the next level, Alex stopped suddenly. He raised his fist, the signal to freeze. My heart began pounding instantly. "What is it?" I whispered. Alex pointed toward the hallway door at the bottom of the stairs. The door was slightly open, and something dark was smeared across it. Blood, fresh enough that it hadn't fully dried. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "Someone was here recently." Marta tightened her grip on the crowbar. Alex slowly pushed the hallway door open. The office floor beyond was a disaster. Desks overturned, computers smashed, papers scattered everywhere like snow. And in the center of the room, a body. A dead man lay face down near the reception desk. Alex approached carefully and nudged the body with his boot. It didn't move. Not a zombie. Just dead. Daniel crouched beside him. "Gunshot wound," he said after a moment. "Not infected." Marta frowned. "So someone shot him." Alex looked around the room carefully. "Which means someone else was here." Right then, a loud metal crash echoed from deeper inside the building. All four of us spun toward the sound. Another noise followed. A door slamming. Footsteps running. Someone was definitely inside. Alex raised his rifle. "Survivors, or trouble," he said quietly. In the silent office building filled with shadows, we all realized the same thing. Zombies weren't the only danger left in this world anymore. Humans could be worse. The office building offered more than shelter, it was a gateway. Through a narrow service door, a stairwell led down into a basement. The air grew colder as we descended, carrying the faint smell of damp concrete and rust. Alex led the way with his rifle raised, while Marta and Daniel followed closely, checking every corner. I stayed behind, scanning the shadows. The basement stretched deeper than I expected. Flickering lights from broken fixtures created a maze of hallways, storage rooms, and forgotten offices. "Why would anyone build a basement this big?" Marta whispered. "Maybe for storage," Daniel said, "or utilities." "Could be both." The sound of dripping water echoed down the halls. Every noise made our hearts race. Alex paused at the first door on the left. He pushed it open slowly. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty canned food, broken boxes of medical supplies, and old tools. We quickly sorted through the items, grabbing everything that could help us survive longer. Marta found a backpack with some fresh water bottles. Daniel checked a small locker and pulled out a handful of batteries and a first aid kit. I examined a pile of old blueprints on a table. They showed the underground passages of the city. "Look at this," I said. There's more than just this building. Underground tunnels, maintenance shafts, it connects to other blocks. Alex frowned. That could be dangerous, but also a way to move without touching the streets. Daniel's eyes sparkled with hope. We could expand our path, go further into the city, unseen by the horde. Marta hesitated. And what if someone else is down there? I shook my head. We'll have to be careful. But if we plan right, we could turn this into our own safe route. We spent the next hours organizing supplies and mapping the basement corridors. By the time night fell outside, we had established a small safe zone underground. The city above was still crawling with zombies, but down here, for the first time in weeks, we felt a glimmer of control. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive. And as we huddled together in the dark, plotting the next stage of our escape, I realized one thing. This wasn't just survival anymore. We were starting to reclaim the city, one step at a time. The sun rose over the ruined city, casting long shadows between the collapsed buildings. From the rooftop, the four of us watched the streets below. The horde had thinned after our crane operations, but the threat remained. We couldn't stay in one place forever. Alex adjusted his rifle, scanning the streets. We've survived this long, but staying on rooftops isn't enough. We need a plan to move further. I looked at the crane behind us, its steel arm gleaming in the morning light. We have two paths, the sky with the crane bridges, or the underground tunnels we just discovered. Marta rubbed her cut forehead. Why not both? Use the rooftops for speed, the tunnels for safety when the streets get too crowded. Daniel nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. We can create a network, sky highways and underground passages. No zombie, no matter how many, can touch us if we plan it right. For the rest of the day, we worked tirelessly. We reinforced crane bridges, secured ropes across rooftops, and mapped out underground passages. The city became our puzzle, and we were finally learning to move in ways the dead could not anticipate. By nightfall, we huddled together on the rooftop of the office building, looking at the city below and the sky above. The horde groaned in the distance, but for the first time in months, we felt in control. Alex broke the silence. We've survived the dead. Now we're surviving the world. Marta smiled faintly. And maybe, one day, we'll reclaim it. I leaned back against the crane's steel frame, feeling the wind on my face. 4 survivors, high above the city, armed with brains, courage, and steel. This was the end of our first year after the apocalypse. A year of fear, of loss, of solitude. But now, together, we had hope. And hope was worth more than any safe rooftop, crane, or underground tunnel. For the first time in 365 days, we weren't just surviving. We were alive.